summer of 1935 in La Crosse was hot and humid, but the beginning of August that year brought record rainfall. It rained so much that the La Crosse River and areas around the marsh flooded. This was after the end of Prohibition, but still in the midst of the Great Depression. Programs to put people back to work were just starting to be implemented, and there was an overall sense of a fresh start. Many of these programs helped to build up the infrastructure of the country, and in La Crosse, this was already happening. A plan for a new airport had just been finalized. A second, much-needed route across the La Crosse River and marsh was finished in 1932, linking West Avenue to the north side of the city. Lock and dam projects along the upper Mississippi had been ongoing. Also, many property owners that could afford to were updating homes and buildings to better fit with the aesthetics of the modern era. One remainder of the old days was the wagon bridge crossing the Mississippi River to Barren Island. This bridge had been finished in 1891, long before automobiles were common and before the route became a U.S. highway, bringing increased traffic. Before the wagon bridge, which could swing open to allow river traffic through, the only way across the river without a boat was in winter, when an ice bridge would be constructed each year. By the 1930s, the aging bridge was often the topic of discussion, especially in newspaper editorial columns. Its deterioration was visible to drivers, and a car accident a few years before was already thought to have weakened it. The Stoddard Hotel, which was a luxury hotel that used to stand across the street from the Rivoli Theater, was one of the buildings that had been remodeled to suit the times, and it was celebrating its reopening on the night of August 8, 1935. Dinner was served in the brand new Crystal Room, which featured many glittering chandeliers and a brand new orchestra platform. Guests were entertained that night with speeches and a vaudeville theater act. Three friends and local businessmen, Carl Shetley, August or Augie Graham as he was called by friends, and Don Gray were in attendance at the hotel with their wives that night. According to Carl Shetley, the men decided to stay behind when their wives opted to go home. They gathered in a hotel room to continue drinking after the event was over. Around midnight, the men began to sober up and became hungry. A plan was hatched to walk down the block to the Harmony Cafe and convince the night cook to make the men some pancakes. According to Carl, the cook said he didn't have the flour to make the pancakes, but that he would do it if they could find some. It just so happened that Augie Graham's family owned the Morning Star Mills, which, among other things, produced flour. The mill was a few blocks away and used to sit at the corner of South Front Street and what was then Mount Vernon Street. Today, it's the location of the La Crosse Center. But back then, this was where the approach to the wagon bridge was. In another part of the city, Captain Fisher Blinn and a friend, Marceline Patro, were picking up two other friends, Frank and Ethel Landrew, for a night out. The men were both employed by the Army Corps of Engineers and had been working on the ongoing lock and dam projects along the river. Thunderstorms had been forecast for the evening, but that didn't keep them from venturing out. Their destination was a place in La Crescent called the Bon Ton Club, a nightclub that featured live music throughout the week. That night, a popular radio and vaudeville act from Chicago called Rube Tronson and the Texas Cowboys was playing. Around 1 a.m., the four headed back to La Crosse in Captain Blinn's 1932 Auburn sedan in search of food at Walt's Restaurant. It's not exactly known if Captain Blinn was familiar with the road, which had a slight curve to it before the bridge approach, or if the forecasted rain had caused slippery conditions, or both. And Blinn later denied under oath being intoxicated that night. Somehow the car jumped the curb and collided with a steel girder at the start of the bridge. In an interview with the La Crosse Tribune at the time, Captain Blinn recalled feeling the car falling immediately after the crash. When the car hit the girder of the bridge, it was forced up about 14 feet, and in the process actually sheared off some of the bolts and a reinforcement plate that had been added after the accident 2 years before. That section of the western part of the bridge immediately collapsed into the river. There were some people camping nearby in Pettibone Park that night, and they reported hearing a loud crash and a groaning sound. They also saw a blue streak of light in the sky as the electric and telephone wires that were strung across the bridge also collapsed. Carl Shetley, Augie Grams, and Don Gray, on their way to the flour mill, had run into La Crosse police officer Bill Boma near the bridge. They asked him why he was in such a hurry, and he told them that the wagon bridge had collapsed. In disbelief, they followed him across the part of the bridge that was still standing. Over 50 years later, when interviewed by Professor Howard Fredericks, Carl Shetley described what he saw when he and his friends arrived at the scene of the crash. "Well, we went over to the end, and there was this one character down in the water, and all he was doing was just screaming. Nothing coherent. You know, I never saw anything like it before or since. Just plain screaming." Captain Blinn and Marceline Patro had managed to escape the car through a window and swam to one of the bridge piers and called for help. Once Captain Blinn and Miss Patro reached the surface of the river, they waited, hoping to see the Landrews come up after them, but they never surfaced. The car was submerged in 12 feet of water, and now, in darkness, Captain Blinn said he was unable to go back down after them. Later, a physician thought perhaps the Landrews had suffered skull fractures in the crash and may have been unconscious and unable to get out of the car. Once police officers arrived at the scene, Captain Blinn and Miss Patro were rescued from the pier and brought to shore. Officer Boma swam to where the car was submerged and pulled Frank and Ethel Landrew out of the car one at a time. The fire department had an inhalator squad that came to attempt to revive them, but after an hour, they were pronounced dead.
Have to be very courageous and brave to go down there. Again, the river was a little bit different at that time, so we might not have seen the depths that we see today with a 9-foot channel, but still, it was at night, I believe, or early morning, so it was going to be dark. They probably could not see and would probably just have to go by feel of what was down there. So it was amazing they were able to get 2 individuals out and go for the others. Secondly, what I thought about is how difficult at that time it must have been to get rescuers to them because they couldn't come from La Crosse if they're going by vehicle. They'd have to do it by boat. They'd have to have rescuers coming from the Minnesota side. We do a lot of mutual aid, even though I'm with the La Crosse Dive Unit, with the river being Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois. There's always mutual aid. So that call would have gone out probably to both states to get agencies there. And just even diving today, there's still parts of that wagon bridge down there, and we're careful if we need to put divers in those areas. And we are tethered to our divers, so there's possibility of that getting tangled down there also if we had sent divers down there.
Carl Shetley had recalled arriving home very late and disheveled after being on the scene. His wife asked him where he had been, and when he told her that the bridge had collapsed, she thought he was joking. It wasn't until she was able to fully process what he was saying and how he looked that she realized he was telling the truth. Captain Blinn and Marceline Patro's injuries were not very serious, and they were released from the hospital a day later. A coroner's inquest was held where a jury heard testimony from 8 people, including from Captain Blinn. Under oath, he maintained that he was not familiar with the road and that neither he nor any of the other passengers were intoxicated. The coroner's jury deliberated for an hour and found that the deaths of Frank and Ethel Landrew were accidental and that Captain Blinn was not in any way responsible. The Landrews had been living in La Crosse temporarily while Frank worked on the lock and dam and were originally from New Orleans. The couple's 2 children had been with a caregiver that night. After the tragic night, family members came and took custody of the children, moving them back down to New Orleans. The collapse of the bridge cut off travel across the Mississippi River. Other bridge crossings were at least 30 miles away. Since La Crosse was a larger city that served much of the outlying rural areas, the absence of the bridge would immediately impact local businesses. A ferry service was quickly implemented, and a temporary span was rebuilt on the wagon bridge in only 11 days. The collapse had been a drastic wake-up call for the city, that the bridge was in need of more than just a few repairs and a new coat of paint. It needed to be replaced. Within hours of the collapse, a committee was put together by the Chamber of Commerce. Area businessmen joined and agreed that they could help the city secure the funding they needed to build a new bridge. They called themselves the Citizens Bridge Committee. The city already knew that a project of this size would cost at least $1 million. In fact, earlier that year, a city councilman had already proposed a resolution for the city to approach the State Highway Commission to begin the process of funding a new bridge. His name was Sherman Lennon, and he said at a council meeting, he had crossed the bridge every day for 6 years when the weather was good, and could see it was weakening under the strain of heavy traffic for which it was not built. Programs under President Roosevelt's New Deal were just beginning to be implemented, and city leaders found that this might be the way to get the funding that they would need for such a large project. The Citizens Bridge Committee hoped to be able to cut through the red tape as much as possible, but they too would run into hurdles that would delay work on a new bridge. Committee members took meetings in Madison and Washington, D.C., and held public events to garner support. Securing the land would be a challenge after it was agreed that the bridge would be located south of the Wagon Bridge, with its eastern approach ending at Cass Street. Some area businesses wanted to get a good price for the property that they would be losing. Another setback was a challenge from a familiar name, Carl Shetley. As part of the Citizens Tax League, he argued that the county could not fund a bridge that was part of a federal highway. The state Supreme Court agreed, and after a reallocation of funds in 1936, construction could finally begin. After 4 years of construction, the bridge was completed and ready to be opened in September of 1939. The Citizens Bridge Committee shifted gears toward planning the grand opening. 15,000 people attended a day-long celebration that began with a parade and ended with a candlelit regatta and fireworks. The mayor of La Crosse at the time, Joseph Vercoda, led a ribbon-cutting ceremony at high noon that afternoon, and a procession of vehicles drove over the new span for the first time. The whistle that used to alert folks to the opening of the old swing span bridge sounded one last time as a ceremonial casket was tossed off the edge into the river, marking the end of the life of the old wagon bridge. The new bridge, which would come to be called the Cass Street Bridge or the Big Blue Bridge, would serve the area well for about 65 years, when a major addition was added to better serve the amount of traffic. Another span was added to allow 2 lanes of traffic in either direction in 2005. The bridge is no longer under the jurisdiction of the city. It is the responsibility of the state, but has to meet federal safety standards. These were updated in 2022, and bridges must be inspected every 24 months. In 2025, the bridge underwent some general maintenance and repair.
Charles Segelke was born in Germany and came to La Crosse in September of 1856. He started a small woodworking shop that became the Segelke & Kohlhaas Manufacturing Company, which manufactured sash, doors, blinds, and other material, including hardwood floors, stairs, stair railings, newel posts, and balustrades. Until the turn of the 20th century, La Crosse was a major lumber milling center, and Segelke Kohlhaas took advantage of the large supply of raw materials available. By 1902, Segelke Kohlhaas was a major manufacturing firm in downtown La Crosse. The company's industrial campus grew to cover several city blocks, including everything west of 2nd Street between Cass Street and Cameron Avenue to the Mississippi River. The company also established branches in Chicago, Milwaukee, and Detroit, each of which consisted of warehouses to store the unfinished work that was shipped from La Crosse, and a small factory that employed 20 to 30 workmen. Early on Sunday, October 26, 1902, 72-year-old Charles Segelke and his 16-year-old grandson Arthur Buste, then a sophomore at La Crosse High School, went out on the Mississippi River with 7 other men to hunt and fish near Brownsville, Minnesota. The group all knew each other and had gone on similar excursions several times before. When they reached their destination, Segelke and Buste left the group in a small skiff to fish by themselves. They were never seen again.
With what's out there on the river, it could easily have hit a stump or something else in the river that might have made them tip, or maybe one of them just stood up and decided that's how they wanted to fish that day, and that's what happened. The water could have been cold at that time, and when they hit the water, hypothermia sets in relatively quickly with the water temperatures at that time. They could have possibly hit their head. I'm assuming they weren't wearing life jackets, which would have helped to get them. So that's a possibility. I've heard stories where someone tried to help the other person and they both got into trouble.
Given the familiarity in the group and the normal habits of the men, it wasn't evident that anything was even wrong until nightfall, when they hadn't yet returned. The group went into Brownsville to see if Charles and Arthur had left the river and went into town. The group headed back to La Crosse and immediately checked in at the Sigelki home in the unlikely event that they had headed back there before the rest of the group. The hope was quickly lost. This would have been the first Charles's wife Augusta and Arthur's parents, Max and Dora Bust, would have heard anything about them being missing. Even though it was full dark, search parties began immediately scouring the river around Brownsville when it was determined Charles and Arthur were missing. Newspapers later noted the futility and danger of that evening's search. The La Crosse Chronicle said this about that night: "It was decided, although as black a midnight as ever lay upon the river made effective searching impossible and made the passage itself dangerous, to send another launch with a big searching party back to the scene of the day's sport. Out into the night went the launch in the teeth of a biting gale, but to no purpose, and morning dawned with still no trace of the missing men." Sigelki Coal House Company executives detailed 10 men from its shops to search the river every day after that. When the boat, an oar, and a minnow pail were discovered a couple of days later, all hope of finding them alive was gone.
Not knowing, they went off and they didn't know where they were. There wasn't any phones or communications at that time, but just going to the landing to see if they would have went home or whatever, what happened. And when they didn't hear that, just to get people out on the river, it's difficult at night, even today, to get out there and try to navigate to find people. But at that time, early on, there's still a chance that you could have found them alive and done some resuscitation or whatever to get them to safety. To me, it would have been scary. I mean, I've been out there at night on the river today, and back then they probably would not have had some of the navigational aids that we have, where you have reflectors off the navigation buoys. So I'm guessing they were just using, I don't know if they even were using spotlights or what type of lights that they had out there to try to help them. So I think it would have been very difficult to do that kind of search at that time. Usually voices carried very well over water. Sometimes I'll hear someone talking and they're farther away than you think. And again, you don't know how far they went out. And that's such a wide area of the river. They could have gone to the Wisconsin side and no one would have realized.
When the search and rescue operations changed over to search and recovery, it was believed that the bodies were likely caught on one of the many wing dams along the shores of the river. These man-made barriers extend partway into the river, forcing water into a fast-moving center channel. This slows the water flow near the riverbanks and reduces sediment buildup. Without modern dive capabilities, if the bodies were caught on one of these dams underwater, they would be hard to discover. To assist in the recovery efforts, searchers used dynamite thrown into the river near these dams in an attempt to dislodge the bodies, which would cause them to float to the surface.
Things really slow down when you go into recovery. When you're out on the rescue, you're trying to do it quickly because there is a potential of saving a life. When you turn into recovery, everybody kind of takes a step back, make sure that the rescuers are doing things safely. We're doing it systematically, so we're covering the area as much as we can at that time. So basically slowing down, making sure we're using all the tools available that's out there to find the individuals. There's lots of, we call them strainers, trees that are in the river that they could have caught something on, some of the wing dams, so many things in the river that they could have easily got caught up on. The dynamite really surprised me. I had never heard of them doing that before. But again, you have to be careful when you're using that dynamite. They could have easily have moved the bodies if they were in that area and then just sent them farther downriver.
The search for the bodies kicked into high gear when a reward was offered by the Sigelki Coal House Company. $500 for Charles and $200 for his grandson Arthur. In today's dollars, that would mean over $25,000. This was advertised in the local newspapers for 40 days straight. This was a powerful incentive and drew the interest of hundreds of searchers in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. Over 2 weeks into the search, the mayor of New Albin, Iowa, 15 miles south of Brownsville, is quoted in the paper as saying, "Though the river and shores between La Crosse and New Albin are full of rivermen, clam diggers, and all sorts of people dragging the river bottom for the bodies of Mr. Sigelki and young Buste, no trace of their remains have yet been found." Sigelki Coal House stopped advertising its reward on December 13th. Ice was probably covering most of the river by then, and nearly all the searchers had given up. One of the many searchers, Herman Effner of Brownsville, was said to have gone temporarily insane over the lost cause and the elusive reward. He became convinced that only he could find the bodies and spent every day for over a month dragging the river bottom in the area between La Crosse and Brownsville. He even regularly visited a trance medium in La Crosse, and for $1, she would share her visions of where exactly to search. His failure to find the bodies must have meant he was doing something wrong, and this belief, along with his dwindling funds, likely accelerated his descent into madness. Despite the tragedy to a founding partner, the Sigelki and Coal House Manufacturing Company carried on and was a major manufacturing concern in downtown La Crosse for over 100 years, from the late 1850s through 1960. However, Prohibition hit La Crosse particularly hard in the 1920s, given its prominent brewing industry, and continuing through the Great Depression, demand for luxury, high-quality millwork and interior finishes dropped off. Parts of the sprawling campus began to close. Many employees were laid off, and the different departments began to consolidate. Further financial troubles in the 1950s led to a bankruptcy that shut it down for good in 1960. Only one historic building remains standing on 2nd Street South, an office building that was recently added to. The area is now largely occupied by the Cass Street entrance and Cameron Avenue exit to the iconic bridge across the Mississippi River. Augusta Sigelki continued to live in La Crosse on 5th Avenue South near Cass Street in the same house she had shared with her husband Charles, until she died in 1922 at the age of 89. She was survived by 2 daughters. One of those daughters, Arthur Buste's mother, Dora, died in Washington, D.C. at the age of 78 in 1944. She was survived by 2 sons, a daughter, and 3 grandchildren.